Stop scrolling. What you're about to learn will shatter the myth of British stars as intellectuals forever. We're used to thinking of them as comedic geniuses, but behind the scenes, these 10 national idols couldn't even remember which way a door opened, driving directors to the brink of breakdowns with their almost clinical stupidity. The final story on our list will truly blow your mind. This actor was a favorite of the Queen, yet died live on air while the audience laughed, mistaking his agony for another ridiculous gag. Watch until the end to find out which of these idols had not a single wrinkle of thought in their head, and how that ringing emptiness made them millions. Drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, is it a brilliant act or a real diagnosis?
Norman Wisdom. When we talk about old-school British comedy, the image that springs to mind is a ridiculous little man in a crooked cap and a jacket too tight across the shoulders. Norman Wisdom was a man who built a dazzling career on the fact that, on screen, not a single thought seemed to linger in his head for more than a second. His legendary Mr. Pitkin became the symbol of an era when audiences wanted to see someone even more foolish than themselves. But the paradox was that this on-screen emptiness fused so completely with the actor's real personality that today it's almost impossible to tell where the script ended and harsh reality began. Colleagues often recalled that working with Norman was like trying to explain quantum physics to a goldfish. He would look at you with kind, utterly vacant eyes, nod earnestly, and a minute later do exactly what he'd just been told not to do. His brain seemed to operate on 3 bytes of memory. As soon as new information arrived, the old was erased without a trace. On set, Norman Wisdom was a walking nightmare for directors used to discipline. He could rehearse a simple scene for hours, just walking from point A to point B, but the moment the camera rolled, he would trip over nothing, crash into the scenery, and stare into the lens with genuine confusion. At first, everyone assumed it was genius improvisation, a masterful display of physical comedy. But over time, camera operators began to notice that Norman genuinely didn't understand why he shouldn't step on cables or stare directly into the lights. His famous cry, "Mr. Grimsdale," wasn't just a comic device, but the cry of a man lost in the simplest of situations, unsure what to do next. That was the secret of his success. He wasn't playing an idiot, he was channeling a state of absolute mental vacuum that simply couldn't be faked. While other actors spent years studying the Stanislavski system, Norman only needed to wake up and step outside. His mind was so untouched by the burden of thought that he seemed like a creature from another universe, one where logic itself was a dirty word. The public adored him because he felt like one of their own, the neighbor who tries to fix a leaky pipe and ends up flooding the entire street. But behind the scenes, that image of innocent simplicity often turned into disaster. Stories circulated that Wisdom could attend a formal premiere reception and behave as if he were still on set, mixing up the names of dignitaries, spilling wine on duchesses' gowns, and giggling foolishly when no one was laughing anymore. This wasn't calculated eccentricity like with modern celebrities. It was a complete lack of breaks, a basic absence of social awareness, the kind you'd politely describe as a limited supply of gray matter. People called him a harmless oddball, but those who encountered him off-camera understood. Inside, there was no one there but a small boy who just wanted a pat on the head. The most astonishing part was that this total inability to analyze or plan helped him outlast all his competitors. While more intelligent actors struggled with existential crises and tried to reinvent themselves, Norman spent decades doing the same thing, falling, shouting, pulling faces. Why change what works when your brain doesn't generate new ideas? He was preserved in his foolishness like a fly in amber. Directors eventually accepted that Wisdom was a force of nature. They didn't give him complex tasks, they simply let him loose on set and waited for chaos to unfold. If a vase needed to be smashed in the most idiotic way imaginable, Norman would deliver brilliantly, because he wasn't calculating the trajectory, he was simply being himself. He was once called Charlie Chaplin's favorite clown, which was perhaps the most flattering way of admitting that intelligence in this profession is optional, sometimes even unnecessary. In the end, Norman Wisdom became a living monument to what Britain calls the pure fool, a man whose head existed solely to carry his trademark cap. He lived to a ripe old age, never quite understanding why people considered him a genius, and that was his truest quality. He didn't reflect, didn't analyze his success, and never tried to appear smarter than he was. He simply existed in a world without cause and effect, where each day was a string of random falls and absurd noises. And when we watch his old films today, we're not laughing at an actor's performance. We're laughing at the astonishing phenomenon of a man who conquered the world armed with nothing but boundless energy and a perfect, ringing emptiness in his head. It was the triumph of instinct over intellect, and Britain has rarely seen anything so funny and so unsettling in its simplicity. Pitkin lives on as long as we choose to believe that foolishness can be harmless, even though, in Wisdom's case, it was nothing short of monumental.
When the conversation turns to a man whose name became synonymous with absurd chases set to sped-up music, we inevitably encounter the phenomenon of Benny Hill. This comedian elevated primitive humor to an absolute, creating a screen universe where intelligence was not merely absent, but treated as something almost hostile. For decades, Benny exploited the image of a greasy, bumbling fool with a perpetually half-open mouth and a gaze that revealed nothing beyond the most basic instincts. His character was the very embodiment of a man whose mind had stalled in adolescence and stubbornly refused to evolve any further. Watching him slap bald old men on the head or chase half-dressed women with a vacant grin, viewers couldn't help but wonder, did a show like this really require a script, or was Benny simply let loose and filmed in his natural state? Among his peers, there were whispers that Hill was a prisoner of a single mental groove, one that operated solely on the flattest jokes imaginable. Off-camera, he gave the impression of someone who struggled to grasp even the decade he was living in, let alone the purpose of complex conversations about politics or culture. His creative method was painfully simple, and in that simplicity, it bordered on something like a mental collapse. While the world evolved, while British television embraced the sharp satire and intellectual wit of Monty Python, Benny Hill persisted with the mechanical determination of a wind-up toy, repeating the same routines that already felt outdated in the era of silent films. His fixation on physical comedy and his inability to reflect or grow earned him the reputation of a man malfunction. His interests were so limited that even enormous fees could not tempt him to change his surroundings or try anything new. It was said that Benny could live for years in a cluttered apartment, surviving on cheap canned food, unable to understand why he even needed the millions in his bank account. This absence of basic life logic and taste permeated his entire existence. He wasn't playing a fool. He lived in a state of permanent mental hibernation, waking only to speed up the footage once more and contort his face into expressions any sane person would consider a sign of a serious condition. On set, Benny Hill was a dictator, but a peculiar one. His genius lay in his refusal to accept anyone else's ideas simply because his mind wasn't built to process outside input. He stewed in his own recycled wordplay and worn-out gags, utterly convinced he was breaking new ground in comedy. This impenetrable certainty, combined with a complete lack of intellectual foundation, made him a figure bordering on the tragic. Directors who worked with him recalled how futile it was to explain the subtleties of staging. He would reduce any task to pulling a face or taking a fall. His humor had no second layer, no subtext, not even a hint of thought. It was comedy of pure reflex, where the audience laughed at just how low human dignity could sink in pursuit of cheap effect. The public saw him as a big child, but it was a child who refused to grow up, to learn, or to recognize reality, preferring instead to remain in his cramped little world where the pinnacle of wit was a pie thrown in someone's face.
What is most astonishing is that this voluntary intellectual emptiness brought him worldwide fame. People across the globe, from the United States to China, understood him without words, because understanding Benny Hill required no mind at all. He became the perfect export product, a universal fool devoid of any deeper meaning. But behind that success lurked a chilling void. Actors who worked on his show noted his pathological inability to engage in any deep emotional interaction. His reactions were formulaic, his conversations shallow. He resembled a complex mechanism programmed to reproduce 5 or 6 comedic tricks with no living soul inside. When his show began to be shut down amid accusations of sexism and lowbrow content, Benny didn't even grasp what had happened. His mind simply couldn't process the concept of a shifting moral landscape. He continued to believe the world consisted of lecherous old men and fleeing women, and this inability to move beyond such a primitive pattern ultimately led him into complete isolation, surrounded by unopened boxes of his own videotapes. The end of Benny Hill was the logical conclusion of a life devoted entirely to the image of the King of Fools. When he was found in his armchair in front of the television several days after his death, many saw it as his final gag. A man who had spent his life making people laugh with his lack of intellect departed just as quietly and absurdly as he had lived. He left behind a legacy that today inspires more bewilderment than laughter. It was an era when Britain allowed itself to laugh at pure, undiluted stupidity, and Benny Hill stood as its chief prophet. His story shows that one can become an idol to generations without reading a single serious book or performing a single meaningful act, as long as one's emptiness aligns with the needs of the crowd. He was living proof that in show business, intelligence can sometimes be nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle, something that gets in the way of wholeheartedly playing the fool before the entire world. And in the ringing vacuum of his mind, there was a peculiar kind of magic that kept millions pressing the power button on their televisions again and again just to reassure themselves that somewhere out there existed a man with absolutely nothing in his head.
Tommy Cooper. When it comes to a man whose face looked as if it had been carved from a single block of bewilderment, Britain speaks in unison: Tommy Cooper. This 2-meter giant, forever wearing his signature red fez, became the living embodiment of the idea that intelligence is hardly a requirement for becoming a national hero. Cooper built his name on tricks that never worked, but the secret of his success lay not in sleight of hand. It was in the audience's genuine belief that he simply didn't understand how the physical world operated. His stage persona didn't just portray stupidity, it radiated a sense of total disorientation in time and space. While fellow illusionists polished their craft to perfection, Tommy walked on stage like a man who had just woken up in someone else's apartment and couldn't find the door. His mind seemed to lag behind reality, creating a hollow pause between question and response. People didn't laugh because he was telling jokes. They laughed because his inability to handle the simplest objects, a deck of cards, a glass of water, even his own cane, felt alarmingly real. Colleagues often recall that backstage Cooper behaved exactly the same way. He could stare at a doorknob for minutes, trying to figure out which way it turned, and it wasn't an act, it was his natural state. On set and in television studios, Tommy Cooper was chaos incarnate. Directors would clutch their heads in despair because Tommy couldn't remember a sequence of actions longer than 2 steps. He might enter from the wrong wing, forget lines he had repeated moments earlier, or begin a trick without the necessary props. Yet the most astonishing part was that his genuine confusion was so infectious that every mistake turned into gold. People saw in him the ultimate big, kind fool, someone in whose mind no complex idea could ever take root. His humor was built on the absurd simplification of reality. If Tommy needed to explain how a mechanism worked, he would simply smack it with his palm and produce a string of incoherent sounds, and somehow that revealed more about his inner world than any scripted line ever could. He was called the master of failure, but in truth he was a master of mental emptiness. In his wandering, unfocused gaze there was not a trace of cunning, only pure distilled incomprehension. Off-stage, Tommy's life was filled with equally absurd episodes that reinforced his reputation as a man with a mind running on empty. He could get into a taxi and forget where he was going, or leave the house wearing only one shoe, never noticing the difference. This everyday helplessness when it came to logic made him nearly useless in the real world, yet transformed him into a god of comedy on screen. His legendary laugh, short, barking, almost canine, was a reaction to his own mistakes, which he made with metronomic regularity. Audiences sensed that Tommy wasn't playing a role, he was simply existing in a permanent cognitive dissonance. For him, the world was a collection of mysterious boxes from which birds occasionally burst, and this absence of any rational filter gave his perception a childlike clarity. His mind was unburdened by analysis. He had no concept of satire or irony. He simply lived in the moment, where a broken umbrella was a catastrophe of cosmic proportions, and a successful trick was a miracle that surprised him more than anyone else in the room. A special chapter in the history of British television belongs to his interactions with the press and his fans. Any attempt at a serious interview inevitably collapsed into farce because Tommy couldn't hold a thread of conversation for more than 10 seconds. His answers missed the point, his jokes landed nowhere, and he looked at the interviewer as if they were speaking an alien language. This impenetrable foolishness was both his shield and his greatest asset. People forgave him everything, alcoholism, whims, constant lateness, simply because it was impossible to expect responsibility from a man with a face like his. He was a prisoner of his own appearance and his inner wiring, which seemed to lack any capacity for critical thought. Even his famous fez, bought on a whim during a tour in Egypt, became a symbol of his absurdity. He wore it simply because it was bright, without a second thought about how it looked. That was Cooper, in essence. Action without thought, reaction without awareness, success without understanding its cause. The tragic end of Tommy Cooper became the highest and most terrifying point of his career. When he collapsed on stage during a live broadcast in 1984, millions of viewers and hundreds in the audience kept laughing. They were convinced it was just another stupid routine, another display of his inability to stay on his feet. The fact that he was dying to the sound of laughter illustrates better than anything the scale of his persona. Britain had grown so accustomed to seeing him as a man devoid of intellect and dignity that even death could not break the illusion. He left this world as he had lived, provoking laughter through complete helplessness. His legacy is hundreds of recordings in which a giant with the face of a child attempts to outwit the laws of nature and fails every time. Tommy Cooper proved that it is possible to become the most beloved man in the country with nothing in his head but good intentions and a complete tangle of thoughts. He was the archetypal foolish giant from fairy tales, mixing up left and right, yet impossible not to love for his sincerity, his enormity, and the vast, hopeless emptiness echoing inside his skull.
Sid James. When we speak of a face that looked as though it had been run over a few times by a double-decker bus and then chewed on by an English bulldog, we inevitably recall Sid James. With his trademark laugh, like the creak of an ungreased cart, he became a living monument to a certain strain of British dim-wittedness. Sid James didn't just play characters with nothing between their ears, he embodied that peculiar type of man who sincerely believes he's the cleverest in the room while being unable to add 2 plus 2. His screen persona was the eternal working-class schemer whose brilliant plans collapsed within minutes under the weight of his own inability to think ahead. On the set of the Carry On films, Sid was a magnet for chaos. His mind seemed to operate on the lowest possible frequency, responding only to the most basic stimuli. Spot a woman, spot a drink, and unleash that thunderous laugh that could scare birds out of trees a mile away. Colleagues often caught themselves wondering whether Sid was learning his lines at all, or simply reacting to cues like a trained seal promised a fish. In his gaze, clouded by chronic exhaustion and cigarette smoke, there stretched such a vast intellectual emptiness that directors rarely even attempted to burden him with complex psychological direction. His method was simple: be as loud and as predictable as possible. While other actors searched for depth, Sid expanded outward, pushing the boundaries of acceptable on-screen foolishness. His characters were always rough, unpolished men, trying to pass as gentlemen, betrayed by every detail, from grimy fingernails to a complete lack of logic in their thinking. Sid had a peculiar gift for turning any intelligent line handed to him into something that sounded like random noise. Whenever he attempted to reason about anything more complicated than the weather, the audience could almost hear the rusty gears in his head grinding uselessly in place. This mental gridlock became his signature. People laughed out of sympathy, but from a sense of superiority. Every man in every pub felt like Einstein compared to Sid James. His popularity rested on his role as a lightning rod for collective stupidity. He absorbed it, concentrated it, and released it back as crude jokes and greasy smirks that came to define an entire era of comedy. Off-screen, Sid was not so different from his on-screen persona, which often led to situations that were as amusing as they were absurd. He was an obsessive horse-racing gambler, yet his methods for picking horses alarmed even the most hopeless punters. It was said he could wager his entire fortune on a horse simply because its name reminded him of his favorite ale. This complete lack of critical thinking and utter disregard for probability made him a bookmaker's dream. Sid lived entirely in the moment, not out of philosophy, but because his mind simply wasn't equipped for long-term thinking. He existed on instinct alone. If he felt good, he laughed. If he felt bad, he drank. And within this simple framework, there was no room for analysis. Friends recalled that holding a conversation with Sid on abstract topics was physically impossible. Within 30 seconds, he would either steer the discussion back to women or drift into a half-conscious daze, eyes open but mind clearly offline, overwhelmed by the effort of processing too much information. On set, he was legendary for forgetting his lines. Sid could play the same dirty old man role for years, yet every new script seemed to him like ancient cuneiform. He had no grasp for humor that required context or subtlety. A joke had to be tangible, heavy, like a brick falling on someone's head. His comedy was physical to the extreme. When Sid attempted to portray cunning, he would squint so hard he could barely see, a perfect metaphor for his life. The harder he tried to appear clever, the more completely he lost his bearings. They called him the face of British humour, and there was a bitter truth in that. Britain at the time wanted to see exactly such a figure reflected back at it, a warm, charismatic, but utterly uncomplicated fool. He was safe, he asked no difficult questions and demanded no thought from his audience. In Sid James's world, everything was simple. If it shines, it's gold. If someone laughs, it's a joke. The end of his career and his life was as sudden and devoid of drama as his roles. He died on stage in Sunderland, and in a cruel twist, his co-star initially thought he was simply going blank again, or playing along with the audience through an unexpected pause. For several long minutes, the crowd watched a dying man, expecting him to leap up, deliver that familiar cackle, and toss out another crude remark.
That inability to distinguish real tragedy from his usual state of mental absence became the final punctuation mark of his story. Sid James left behind hundreds of roles in which he perfected the art of the fool. He proved that to become an icon, one need not possess brilliance. It is enough to have a face like a worn-out glove and a mind that never interferes with the simple pleasures of life. His legacy is the triumph of simplicity over complexity, of reflex over reason, of a ringing emptiness over any attempt to be more than what he was, a funny man with a cigarette between his teeth and not a single thought in his head. Sid was the kind of man who could get lost in his own bathroom, and that precisely is why an entire nation adored him, seeing in his zero intellect the purest form of authenticity.
Charles Hawtrey. When we study the thin, almost bird-like face of Charles Hawtrey, with his ever-present round bicycle spectacles, we see a man who perfected the image of the highly intelligent fool to an unsettling degree. But Hawtrey's secret was that there was no intelligence behind it at all, only a facade, a carefully arranged decoration concealing a vast mental void. Charles was the kind of figure who looked like a professor of ancient languages, yet in reality couldn't remember which way to twist the cap off a bottle of milk. His presence during the golden age of British comedy carried a strange, almost otherworldly detachment. It seemed as though his mind operated on some inaccessible frequency, beyond ordinary understanding, but a closer look revealed that this frequency was nothing more than static. Colleagues from the Carry On films often recalled Hawtrey had a peculiar gift. He could stare straight through a person for so long and so intently that they began to believe in his hidden wisdom, until he suddenly asked something astonishingly foolish, like, "Why do we need a camera if we've already rehearsed everything?" In his mind, thoughts didn't linger. They passed straight through, encountering no resistance in the form of logic or even the most basic grasp of reality. On set, Charles Hawtrey was the embodiment of a capricious child trapped in the body of an aging man with spectacles. His behavior baffled even the most seasoned producers because it lacked any trace of common sense. He could erupt into a full-blown tantrum over the color of his socks, not matching the curtains on a set that wouldn't even appear on screen. This wasn't the perfectionism of a master, it was the fixation of a mind incapable of grasping the bigger picture, clinging instead to the most trivial and absurd details. Hawtrey lived in a world where importance was determined not by meaning, but by brightness or spatial placement. Directors quickly learned that giving him complex instructions was pointless. You had to point to a spot and hope that at that precise moment nothing short-circuited in his head. His humor thrived on this bizarre, almost disturbing inappropriateness. He could deliver complete nonsense with absolute seriousness, and audiences would collapse with laughter, sensing that he wasn't joking, he genuinely believed what he was saying. It was a triumph of form over substance, where perfect diction and upright posture concealed the hollow echo of a zero-level intellect. Off-screen, Charles's life was even more absurd and chaotic, reinforcing his reputation as a man with nothing at all in his head. He lived with his elderly mother who suffered from dementia, and their existence together resembled an endless comedy sketch, two people, both stripped of logic, attempting to interact with reality. Stories circulated that Charles could leave the house to buy bread and return 3 days later from another city, with no idea how he got there or why he still had the loaf. His inability to navigate social situations became legendary. He might approach one of the most powerful figures in the British film industry and begin complaining about the wilted daisies in his garden, ignoring any attempts to discuss contracts or new projects. This mental dead end made him impossible to manage, yet it also created the unique aura of strangeness that millions adored. He was not of this world in the most literal sense. His cognitive limitations simply wouldn't allow him to fit into it.
A special place in his story belongs to his relationship with alcohol and his own fame. Hawtrey sincerely believed he was the greatest actor of his time, despite a range limited to awkward men in glasses. This complete lack of self-awareness was a clear sign that no real analytical process was taking place inside his head. He accepted illusion as reality, with the ease of someone untouched by logic or imagination. When film offers dried up due to his impossible behavior and constant memory lapses, he didn't seem to notice. His mind simply failed to register the idea of failure. He continued to see himself as a major star, sitting in his neglected home and speaking to imaginary admirers. It was a tragic comedy of a man whose intellect couldn't withstand the weight of reality and quietly shut itself down, leaving behind only a shell with a peculiar voice and awkward habits. The final chapter of Charles Hawtrey's life was as strange as any role he ever played. When a fire broke out in his home, he refused to leave until he found his favorite glasses, even as the building was already consumed by the flames. That willingness to risk everything for a trivial object perfectly illustrates how his mind worked, or failed to. In his later years, he became something of a local curiosity, wandering the streets of a seaside town, startling passers-by with sudden movements and disjointed tirades. Britain remembered him as Odd Charlie, a man who turned his own foolishness into a kind of high art without ever realizing it. His legacy lives on in dozens of films where he stands, mouth slightly open, peering at the world through thick lenses, and we understand that behind those lenses there is not a single thought, not a single plan, not a spark of comprehension. Only an endless, bottomless bewilderment, the very thing that made him one of the most foolish and yet most unforgettable actors of his era. Hawtrey proved that a person can go through life completely empty inside, so long as that emptiness is colorful enough to keep people laughing for decades.
Bernard Bresslaw. Whenever this 2-meter giant stepped into frame, the viewer felt an instinctive urge either to move back, lest he be crushed, or to call social services on the spot, because Bernard Breslaw's gaze radiated such pure, unfiltered, utterly unburdened kindness that it became almost unsettling. He stood as a walking embodiment of a very British paradox, the monumental body of an atlas topped with a head that seemed to run on the circuitry of a kitchen timer. His signature persona was that of a colossal simpleton with a squeaky voice, a man who could be startled by his own shadow and fall into a stupor at the sight of anything more complex than a spoon. In the golden age of comedy, Bresslaw occupied the niche of the nation's chief slow-wit. His mind appeared to function on steam power. By the time a cue reached his awareness, by the time the boiler heated and the pistons began to move, the scene was already over, and Bernard would deliver his reaction to a joke that had been told 5 minutes earlier. Colleagues recalled that working with him was exhausting not because of his size, but because of his astonishing inability to grasp even the simplest metaphors. If a director told him, "Bernie, imagine you're furious," he might stand there for half an hour, mouth slightly open, trying to comprehend the very concept of anger, until something short-circuited in his mind and he broke into loud, involuntary hiccups from sheer mental strain. On set, Bernard Bresslaw was legendary for his everyday absurdity. Possessing the strength to bend iron, he had no control over his own size, his spatial awareness hovering somewhere at the level of a houseplant. He could demolish half an expensive set simply by scratching the back of his head, all the while genuinely unable to understand why everyone around him was shouting and clutching their chests. His famous line, "I didn't mean to," became the unofficial motto of his life. Audiences adored him for that very contrast. Here was a man who looked capable of conquering the world, yet found himself tangled in his own shoelaces, on the verge of tears because he couldn't figure out how to get free.
This wasn't subtle character work, it was the blunt reality of a man whose intellect simply couldn't keep pace with the mass of his own body. Directors on the Carry On series quickly realized that Bresslaw was a natural resource best used as he was, without adding a single drop of logic. His characters existed as background engines of chaos. If someone needed to miss a chair while sitting down or wear a cooking pot instead of a helmet, Bernard did it better than anyone, because he did it with complete, unshakable conviction. Off-screen, his life was filled with episodes that confirmed his zero intellect was no act. It was said he could spend half a day waiting at a bus stop for a route that had been cancelled the year before, simply because the sign was still there. His inability to question reality made him the perfect target for pranks. Colleagues could convince him of anything, that giant rabbits lived on the moon, that the Queen herself had asked him to wear a pink tie on Thursdays. Bernard believed it all, because there was no filter in his mind separating truth from fiction. For him, the world was a series of bright images and loud sounds that never formed a coherent chain. He lived in a permanent present, with no memory of yesterday and no concept of tomorrow. This mental blankness made him endearing, but utterly helpless in any situation requiring even the slightest responsibility. When asked about his future plans, he would often reply, "I want ice cream," and that was the deepest existential statement he could manage. A special role in his persona was played by his voice. With his towering frame, one expected a bass that could shake the ground, but Bernard produced a thin, trembling falsetto that completed the effect. This dissonance between powerful exterior and childlike interior became his goldmine. Yet there was a quiet tragedy to it. Bresslaw genuinely wanted to perform Shakespeare. He spent hours trying to memorize Hamlet's monologue, but his mind refused to process anything longer than a slogan. He mixed up words, forgot the end of a sentence while still speaking its beginning, turning tragedy into farce without even realizing it. His attempts to be taken seriously were the funniest spectacle in London at the time. People laughed in his face, and he smiled back, believing it was admiration. That innocent simplicity, that complete absence of self-awareness, spoke of a perfectly hollow interior, a resonant emptiness in which only the occasional thought of food or sleep drifted by. Bernard Bresslaw died too early, unable to keep up with the pace of a profession that demanded at least a fragment of focus. His heart gave out under the strain, and his mind likely never understood what had happened. Britain lost its gentle giant, a man who proved that one could become a star of the highest order with the intellect of a small child. His legacy lives on in scenes of a massive man with a worry-free face trying to squeeze into a tiny car or wrestling with an inflatable mattress. In those moments lies the essence of his comedy, the triumph of matter over spirit, with the spirit conspicuously absent. Bresslaw remains in memory as perhaps the most dim-witted strongman of the cinematic world, a man whose emptiness was so vast it could have hidden an entire football team. He stood as living proof that happiness and fame require no intellect at all, only the ability to be big, loud, and utterly irreversibly sincere in one's absurdity. It was an older tradition, in which stupidity was not a fault but a monument, something so grand you couldn't pass it without at least a smile.
Hattie Jacques. Whenever Hattie Jacques appeared on screen, the space around her seemed to contract, stooping to the presence of this monumental woman who became the embodiment of the British matron, a figure marked by an almost complete absence of mental flexibility. Hattie was the only woman in this pantheon of bewildered screen personalities who could make any man surrender with nothing more than her majestic, utterly vacant gaze. Her signature roles, the stern senior nurse or overbearing authority figure, drew their power not from knowledge or competence, but from an unshakable, almost fanatical devotion to rules, even when those rules made no sense at all.
She represented a peculiar kind of intellectual drought, the sort found in people who sincerely believe that order matters more than reason. Her mind functioned like an old filing cabinet, full of information, perhaps, but sorted into dusty folders no one had opened since the Victorian age. Colleagues from the Carry On films often recalled her uncanny ability to deliver the most absurd and illogical demands with the gravity of someone reciting the laws of thermodynamics. There was never a flicker of doubt in her eyes, and, as is often the case, that absence of doubt suggested that no real thinking had taken place at all. On set, Hattie Jacques was an island of peculiar calm in a sea of chaos, but that calm came not from composure, but from the sluggish pace of her cognitive reactions. If something unexpected happened in a scene, an explosion, or the sudden appearance of a naked man, Hattie required several long seconds to process the shift in reality. Her comedy was built on that delay. While everyone else panicked and ran, she might continue adjusting her cap, because in her mental schedule, respond to disaster came only after check collar cleanliness. Directors adored her for this natural, unforced simplicity, something no actor could convincingly imitate. She wasn't playing a limited character, she was channeling a person whose entire horizon of thought extended no further than the edge of her desk. Whenever her characters attempted cleverness, it resembled a steam engine trying to take flight, a great deal of noise, smoke, and strain, only to end up moving along the same old tracks toward a dead end. Her humour was deeply social, a reflection of British bureaucracy itself, where, in place of a brain, there seems to be an official stamp. Off-screen, Hattie's life was just as paradoxical and devoid of logic, often leaving those close to her perplexed. It was said that in everyday matters requiring even the simplest reasoning, she was completely helpless. She could argue for hours with a shopkeeper about the price of eggs, unable to grasp concepts like inflation or seasonality, and leave empty-handed, proud of her victory over common sense. Her personal life resembled a tangled maze in which she was constantly lost. The story of how she lived in the same house with both her husband and her lover, explaining it as simply convenient, became legendary. It wasn't a sign of progressive thinking or clever planning. Hattie simply saw no contradiction in it, because her mind did not register moral or logical dilemmas. She lived by instinct, wrapped tightly in a layer of middle-class propriety. For her, the world followed simple rules. If there are 2 men in the house, then there must be 2 breakfasts, and that's that. Any attempt by others to appeal to her logic shattered against the granite wall of her incomprehension. She regarded her advisers as if they were mad, sincerely convinced that it was they who had the problem for overcomplicating such obvious matters. A special place in her career belonged to her portrayal of authority figures. Hattie created the definitive image of the boss from hell, someone who had no idea what they were doing, yet did it with unwavering confidence. Her characters were always convinced of their own infallibility, which is perhaps the highest form of foolishness. People laughed because they recognized in her that familiar neighbor or aunt who offers advice on quantum physics without knowing how to operate a microwave. Hattie was a master of the pause, that ringing silence in which the audience understood that behind her composed exterior absolutely nothing was happening. It was another triumph of form over substance, a commanding posture, a firm voice, and a vast crystalline emptiness behind the facade. She was living proof that to lead the parade, one doesn't actually know where it's going. It's enough to march loudly and possess the confidence to ignore the cliffs ahead. Hattie Jacques passed away at the height of her peculiar fame, leaving behind a void no other actor could fill. Britain lost its great mother, whose foolishness was so monumental it felt almost architectural in scale. Her legacy lives on in hundreds of scenes where she performs the most absurd actions with unshakable dignity. She taught a nation to laugh at its own rigidity and limitations, revealing that behind the stern face of authority there is often just a large child who never quite learned how to think logically. Hattie Jacques remains in history as the queen of zero intellect, a woman whose mind was somehow too vast for such trivialities as common sense. She was old school in the most literal way, from an era when authority was built on the width of one's waist and the volume of one's voice, and intelligence was considered an optional accessory to a good wardrobe and a well-timed frown. Her example proved one simple truth. To be remembered, you don't have to be intelligent, you just have to be unforgettable in your grand, magnificent, and utterly impenetrable lack of thought.
Kenneth Williams. When we look at Kenneth Williams, at his theatrically flaring nostrils, his affectedly lifted chin, and hear that piercing, haughty voice, the illusion arises that we are in the presence of one of the great intellectuals of his age. But that was the cruelest trick British television ever played. Kenneth Williams was the king of hollow aristocracy, a man whose facade was built from pure, concentrated snobbery, behind which lay a perfect, ringing mental vacuum. His screen persona was the eternal expert on everything from Egyptology to quantum physics, who in reality could not tell left from right without assistance. Williams pushed to the extreme the idea that if you spoke with the proper accent and regarded others as dirt beneath your fingernails, no one would notice that absolutely nothing was happening inside your skull. Colleagues recalled that working with Kenneth was like playing chess with a pigeon. He would knock over the pieces, foul the board, and strut away as if victorious, utterly convinced of his superiority. His mind operated in a constant loop of self-admiration, leaving no room for such trivialities as logic, knowledge, or even a basic understanding of the script. When he had to pronounce a complicated term, he did so with such force that the audience believed he knew exactly what he was talking about, while the actor himself was thinking only about whether his nose was shining too brightly under the stage lights. On set, Kenneth Williams embodied arrogant ignorance. He could spend hours arguing with a director over how his character should hold a teacup, backing up his claims with entirely fabricated historical facts, invented on the spot. This was not lying in the conventional sense, it was the unshakable certainty of a man whose intellect was too limited to distinguish reality from his own imagination. He lived in a world where his personal opinion was absolute truth simply because it belonged to him. Directors quickly realized that Kenneth was a black hole for common sense. Any reasonable idea that entered his orbit vanished without a trace, replaced by torrents of incoherent yet grandiose monologues. His humor was built on this immense dissonance between form and content. When he portrayed Caesar or Henry VIII, audiences laughed not at the parody itself, but at how utterly foolish and helpless this great ruler appeared when faced with the simplest of tasks. It was the triumph of posturing over reason, where flawless diction concealed a complete inability to connect two thoughts into a coherent chain. Off-screen, Kenneth's life was even more grotesque and devoid of basic meaning. He was pathologically dependent on the opinions of others, yet despised everyone around him, creating a constant mental static that prevented him from focusing on anything substantial. Stories circulated that he could fall into a week-long depression because a waiter had placed a knife on the wrong side of his plate, interpreting it as a personal affront. His everyday helplessness became legendary. He might stand for hours before a closed door, failing to realize it simply needed to be pushed rather than pulled, all the while delivering loud speeches about the decline of modern architecture.
This absence of practical sense, combined with his inflated ego, left him completely unfit for reality. His diaries, which he kept for decades, became monuments to this mental isolation, thousands of pages filled with complaints of indigestion and petty grievances, without a single glimmer of deeper thought or reflection on the world. He was trapped in the narrow cage of his zero intellect, carefully gilding its bars with the gold paint of his eloquence. A special place in his story belongs to his manner of dealing with the public. Kenneth Williams was a master of intellectual bluff. On talk shows, he could drown out any opponent, wielding complex words in entirely inappropriate contexts, and emerge victorious purely through audacity. People laughed at him because they saw in him a caricature of the British establishment, those very figures who governed the country without the faintest idea of how ordinary people lived. Kenneth was an empty vessel that rang louder than all the rest. His comedy was, in many ways, a defensive reflex against an unspoken awareness of his own limitations he masked so carefully behind the persona of a snob. When he made his signature face, lower lip thrust forward, it was a signal that his mind had reached a dead end, an internal error, yet the audience read it as the height of irony. That was his peculiar genius. He convinced the world that his foolishness was in fact a subtle and nearly unattainable form of wit. The final chapter of Kenneth Williams' life was dark and solitary, a natural consequence of existing within such a vacuum. He never managed to reconcile himself with reality, which demanded more of him than the ability to pull faces. His death from a drug overdose remains a subject of debate, but many see it as the last act of a man unable to cope with even the simplest demands of life. Kenneth left behind the image of the most arrogant fool in cinematic history. His legacy lives on in endless reruns of the Carry On films, where he continues with unwavering aplomb to commit one absurdity after another. He proved that one can become a legend armed with nothing more than a set of mannerisms and a complete absence of thought, provided one knows how to present that emptiness as something elite. Williams belonged to an older school in the most ironic sense, a world in which form did not merely outweigh content, but annihilated it entirely. He remains in the national memory as a man whose head was filled with nothing but the echo of his own voice, and it was precisely that resonant emptiness that made him one of the most ridiculous and enduringly amusing figures in British comedy. A figure the country continues to laugh at decades later, perhaps without ever fully realizing how serious it all was. Kenneth stood as living proof that intelligence is merely optional, something that can be successfully replaced with a well-trained accent and a timely flare of the nostrils.
Dick Emery. When we think of Dick Emery, we don't see a single man, but a kaleidoscope of absurd characters, each one possessing a unique ability to push common sense to the brink of extinction. Emery was a master of disguise, yet beneath all the wigs, false teeth, and ridiculous costumes lay the same unsettling truth. His characters were utterly, spectacularly empty inside. He built his career on a simple premise that British audiences love nothing more than laughing at people who have no idea what's going on, and he drove that idea to monumental absurdity. The Dick Emery Show became a testing ground for human foolishness in all its forms, from lecherous vicars to dizzy blondes with the intellect of a goldfish. Colleagues often remarked that working with Dick was like trying to assemble a puzzle where every piece was blank. He immersed himself so deeply in these zero-intellect roles that it sometimes felt as if his own mind dissolved into that ocean of nonsense. His brain functioned like a high-speed copying machine, perfectly replicating the outward behavior of fools while paying no attention whatsoever to substance.
On set, Emery could spend hours rehearsing a single idiotic grin, polishing it to mechanical perfection, until directors began to wonder if there was truly nothing behind the mask. His creative method relied entirely on exploiting cognitive dissonance. His characters were always people with a fundamental defect in logic. Take, for example, his famous blonde, Mandy, whose signature line, "Oh, you are awful," became something of a national catchphrase for those incapable of forming even the simplest thought. Audiences laughed until they cried, because through her, Emery projected a state of complete mental weightlessness. In her world, there were no cause and effect relationships, only fleeting impulses and a total inability to remember what had been said moments before. It was instinct triumphing over intellect. Directors noted that Dick possessed an extraordinary ability to switch off his brain at will. One moment he could be discussing technical details of a shoot, and the next he would transform into a character who didn't know how to use a door handle. What was more unsettling, however, was how that boundary began to blur over time. Off-camera, Dick often caught himself slipping into the intonations of his most foolish characters, as if his own mind had nothing more complex to offer. In real life, Emery's lack of practical sense bordered on the disastrous, reinforcing the idea of his zero-level intellectual foundation. He was married 5 times, and each marriage ended for the same reason. He simply did not understand how human relationships functioned outside the framework of a comedy sketch. To him, life was a series of roles, and whenever he was required to show sincerity or depth, he would freeze, like a computer encountering a critical error. Stories circulated that he could spend a fortune on utterly pointless things, buying, for instance, a collection of old wagon wheels simply because they spin in a funny way. This absence of any rational filter made him an easy target for opportunists and flatterers. Emery lived inside a bubble of his success, oblivious to the changing world around him, a world that demanded subtlety and reflection. His mind was tuned to a single purpose, to provoke immediate instinctive laughter, and when that purpose vanished, he seemed to fade into a pale shadow of himself, incapable of even basic planning. A notable part of Emery's career was his interaction with fans. Dick Emery was a master of surface-level charm. He could win over a crowd in minutes, but the moment someone tried to engage him in a serious conversation, he would lose the thread entirely. His brain wasn't built to process complexity. He was a kind of human projection screen, reflecting others' expectations while containing nothing behind it but emptiness. People laughed because they recognized in his characters the distilled essence of the average Brit, someone whose world revolved around television and the local pub. Emery portrayed Britain as a nation of charming, likable, yet hopelessly confused individuals, and he did so with a conviction that only someone unburdened by deeper understanding could achieve. He was called the Man of 1,000 Faces, and it was true. But the bitter irony was that none of those faces belonged to a truly intelligent man. The final chapter of Dick Emery's life was as restless and devoid of deeper meaning as his show. He continued performing even as his jokes began to miss their mark and his memory started to fail. He might walk on stage and forget which character he was supposed to be, blending the lines of a vicar with those of a street tramp. This decline felt like the inevitable outcome of a life lived in a state of switched-off awareness. Emery left behind a vast archive of recordings that now stand as a monument to an era when foolishness was the nation's favorite form of entertainment. He proved that it is possible to be adored by millions without a single original idea or deeply held belief. His legacy is the triumph of imitation over essence, a dazzling surface concealing the echoing emptiness of a zero intellect. Dick Emery remains remembered as the most gifted imitator of fools, a man who became so absorbed in the role that he ultimately became its prisoner. It was the old school, where an actor was valued for the ability to pull a face at the right moment, not for the ability to think, and in that art Dick had no equal. He elevated mental emptiness to the level of national treasure. Britain still laughs at his characters, perhaps never fully realizing that behind that laughter lies the quiet tragedy of a man whose mind was simply too simple for a complex world. Dick was living proof that to conquer television screens, intelligence can sometimes be nothing more than excess baggage, something that only gets in the way of making a fool of yourself with effortless ease before the eyes of the entire world.
Arthur Lowe. Whenever Arthur Lowe appeared on screen, the audience instantly recognized in him that very type upon which the British Empire had long stood, and upon which its boundless foolishness also rested. The small man with an inflated ego, whose confidence in his own importance was directly proportional to his lack of common sense. Lowe became a living icon through his role as Captain Mainwaring in Dad's Army, creating a monumental figure of the Captain Obvious, who could see no further than his own nose, yet took it upon himself to command the fate of a nation. His character was the purest embodiment of zero intellect, wrapped in a stiff three-piece suit and seasoned with a brand of absurd patriotism. Lowe possessed a rare gift. He could gaze at the world with such gravity and apparent depth that for a moment people forgot that he had just ordered an advance against an invisible enemy in the wrong direction. Colleagues recalled that he was so perfectly aligned with his role as a dim-witted commander that it sometimes seemed his own mind functioned solely as a transmitter of slogans in regulations, leaving no space for even the most basic logic. He was a master of mental stillness, a state in which no thought moves at all, yet the facade remains impeccably dignified. People laughed not at his jokes, but at how absurd human stupidity looks when it sincerely believes itself to be wisdom. On set, Arthur Lowe was legendary for his arrogant disconnect from reality. His working method consisted of ignoring any modern ideas or directorial advice that struck him as too clever. He lived within a cocoon of his own understanding of how a proper gentleman ought to behave, and that cocoon was entirely impervious to outside influence. It was said he could spend hours debating the correct angle of his cap, while the entire crew waited for him to remember a single line. His cognitive machinery seemed designed for one purpose only, maintaining the status of his character. Whenever a script demanded even a trace of mental flexibility, Lowe would slip into what camera operators jokingly called screen coma. His gaze turned glassy, his nostrils flared with indignation, a clear signal that the processor inside his skull had overheated and shut down. The humor of his performance rested on the absolute helplessness of his character in the face of anything unexpected. Mainwaring, as played by Lowe, was the sort of man who would attempt to stop a tank with an umbrella and then reprimand the driver for improper parking. Off-screen, Lowe's life was filled with episodes that suggested his zero intellect was no mere performance. He was an enthusiastic yachtsman, yet his navigational skills were the subject of endless jokes in ports across Britain. It was said he could set out to sea without a map or compass, firmly convinced that the shoreline would find him if he looked sufficiently authoritative at the helm. This lack of understanding of basic cause and effect turned his life into a chain of absurd incidents from which he always emerged with unshaken self-importance, never quite grasping what had gone wrong. His everyday logic was so rudimentary that friends compared him to a child who believes he can hide simply by covering his eyes. Lowe genuinely failed to understand why people laughed at his solemn reflections on morality or politics, interpreting their amusement as admiration for his eloquence. His mind was sealed off from irony, which made him an ideal subject for comedy. He was a pure fool in the highest, almost biblical sense, a man whose emptiness was so vast that there was not even room within it to doubt his own brilliance. A notable aspect of his life was his relationship with alcohol and discipline.
Lowe could indulge a little too freely just before going on air, yet even in a state of deep intoxication he retained the bearing of a Lord Chancellor, which only heightened the absurdity. His slurred speech and unsteady gait, paired with a commanding tone, created a strikingly comic effect, a caricature of British hierarchy, where rank outweighs substance. People laughed because they saw in him the embodiment of countless petty tyrants inhabiting offices and institutions, men with empty heads and an overwhelming desire to control every detail of your life. Lowe was a harmless kind of menace, a fool so predictably foolish that he inspired not fear but a mixture of pity and uncontrollable laughter. He was once called the conscience of the nation, though it was the conscience of a man who had long since forgotten what reflection meant, replacing it with habit and superstition. The final chapter of Arthur Lowe's career was as grandly absurd as his roles. He continued to play his captain even as his memory began to unravel completely. He took to the stage with a prompter feeding him lines, yet even that proved insufficient. His mind simply refused to process the incoming words, producing instead fragments, broken phrases, and incoherent exclamations. It was a spectacle both tragic and comic, a towering authority figure with nothing left behind it but the echo of past triumphs. Lowe departed, leaving behind the image of perhaps the most foolish leader in British cinema, a man who proved that to lead others it is not necessary to know the way. It is enough to insist that the dead end is in fact the destination. His legacy is the triumph of self-importance over intellect, of ringing emptiness over logic, of form over any trace of meaningful content. Arthur Lowe remains in memory as a king of fools of the old school, a man whose zero intellect became his greatest contribution to culture, reminding us that the funniest people are often those who, with the utmost seriousness, speak complete and utter nonsense. Britain still watches his performances, recognizing in Captain Mainwaring those traits of national folly that make life so unpredictable and absurd. Arthur stood as living proof that for true fame, intellect counts for nothing. It is enough to believe utterly in your own infallibility, even if you find yourself standing in a single shoe in the middle of a burning pub.
These 10 actors of the old school proved a paradoxical truth. To become a national treasure and make millions shake with laughter, a sharp mind is often not an advantage, but an inconvenience. Their greatness was built on a foundation of raw, unfiltered foolishness, untouched by reflection, which, in their hands, became a form of high art, a deliberate surrender of common sense. We saw how Norman wisdom turned an infantile void into pure gold, how Benny Hill made simplicity a way of life, and how Arthur Lowe erected a monument to arrogant ignorance. These performers didn't merely play fools, they transmitted a state of complete mental freedom, unburdened by logic, cause and effect, or intellectual weight. In a world that constantly demands efficiency and rationality, these empty-headed giants offered something almost therapeutic, the chance to laugh at the very nature of human absurdity. Their characters, from awkward men in thick glasses to booming, overbearing matrons, became mirrors in which Britain recognized its own most ridiculous and endearing traits, disguised as tradition and authority. The tragedy and triumph of these artists lay in the way the boundary between role and reality often blurred, leaving us with an unsettling question. Where did the great performance end, and where did the man begin? The man who might genuinely not know which way a door opens. And yet it was precisely that echoing emptiness within their characters that created a resonance still felt today. They are gone, but they left behind an era when comedy was physical, sincere, and unapologetically foolish, in the best possible sense of the word.
Their legacy reminds us that sometimes the shortest path to an audience's heart does not lie through subtle satire or intricate storytelling, but through a perfectly timed wide-eyed stare, a forgotten line, and that grand, magnificent absence of thought, the kind that makes us all equal in the face of life's chaos. These 10 legends will forever remain in history as masters of the blank slate, proving that even if your mind holds absolutely nothing, you can still become the standard by which an entire world of comedy measures itself.